The letter found at a funeral changed everything Dr. Phil thought he knew about marriage, trust, and the secrets people carried to their graves. It was a Tuesday afternoon taping when Dr. Phil held a white envelope in his hands, staring at it as if the paper itself might explode. The cameras were rolling, the audience was silent, and across from him sat Margaret Chin, a 58-year-old widow whose hands trembled in her lap. What started as a routine grief counseling session had just become something else entirely, something darker, something that would force Dr. Phil to stop the show, call his producers, and make a decision that would change the direction of an entire episode. "Stop the tape," Dr. Phil said quietly. The words hung in the air like smoke. Just stop everything. The studio lights dimmed slightly as production crew members exchanged confused glances. In 21 years of taping, Dr. Phil had only stopped production a handful of times. This was one of them. Because what Margaret had just revealed wasn't just a secret. It was a double life so carefully constructed, so meticulously hidden that even Dr. Phil, a man who had spent decades reading people, hadn't seen it coming. But to understand how we got to this moment, we need to go back 3 weeks. Back to when Margaret first walked through the studio doors clutching a worn leather journal and a letter she had found tucked inside her late husband's jacket at his memorial service. Subscribe and leave a comment because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. 3 weeks earlier, Margaret Chin had been married for 32 years to David Chin, a respected pharmacist in their suburban Ohio community. They had raised 2 children, celebrated anniversaries, attended church together every Sunday. David was the kind of man neighbors waved to, the kind who shoveled elderly Mrs. Patterson's driveway every winter without being asked. When he died suddenly of a heart attack at age 61, the entire community mourned. The funeral was packed. Over 300 people filled the church. Margaret stood at the receiving line for hours, shaking hands, accepting condolences, hearing story after story about how David had helped someone, remembered a birthday, went out of his way to be kind. It was during the reception in the church basement that Margaret noticed something odd. A woman she didn't recognize, perhaps in her early 40s, standing in the corner, watching, not crying, not mingling, just watching Margaret with an expression that was difficult to read. Not quite grief, not quite anger, something in between. Margaret approached her. "Thank you for coming. I'm David's wife, Margaret." The woman's face did something strange, a flicker of recognition, then something that looked almost like pity. "I know who you are," she said quietly. Then she handed Margaret a small white envelope. "He would have wanted you to have this. I'm sorry." And before Margaret could ask another question, the woman was gone, disappearing into the crowd of mourners. What Margaret found inside that envelope would unravel 32 years in 60 seconds. Back in her empty house that evening, Margaret sat at the kitchen table where she and David had eaten thousands of meals together. Her hands shook as she opened the envelope. Inside was a single piece of paper, handwritten in David's unmistakable script. "Margaret, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and I can no longer hurt you with the truth I've been too cowardly to tell. For the last 14 years, I've been living a double life." The words didn't make sense at first. Margaret read them again and again. Double life? What did that even mean? The letter continued. "Her name is Rachel. We met at a pharmacy conference in 2010. What started as a friendship became something I never intended. I have another family, Margaret, a daughter. She's 12 years old. Her name is Emma." Margaret dropped the letter. The paper fluttered to the kitchen floor, but she couldn't move to pick it up.
Several people in the front row wiped away tears. When he finished, Dr. Phil set the letter down and looked directly into the camera. "Folks, in 21 years of doing this show, I've seen a lot of things, but this level of sustained deception, this elaborate construction of a parallel life, this is something else entirely." He turned back to Margaret. "How are you processing this? Because you're not just grieving the loss of your husband, you're grieving the loss of the marriage you thought you had." "I don't know who I was married to," Margaret whispered. "Was any of it real? When he said he loved me, did he mean it? Or was I just the convenient wife while she was the one he really wanted?" Dr. Phil leaned forward. "Margaret, here's what I know, and I want you to hear this clearly. This is not about you. This is not about anything you did or didn't do. This is about a man who made a choice every single day for 14 years to lie to you." But Margaret wasn't done. She reached back into her purse and pulled out David's journal. "There's more," she said quietly. "I found his journal. He wrote about both lives, about how he compartmentalized everything, about how he justified it to himself." Dr. Phil took the journal, but before he could open it, Margaret spoke again. "And I found her, Rachel, the other woman. I called the number in his phone. We talked for 2 hours." Off camera, Dr. Phil made a choice no producer expected. Dr. Phil set the journal down carefully and looked at his producer in the control booth. He made a gesture, cutting his hand across his throat. "Stop recording." The cameras stopped. The audience murmured in confusion. Dr. Phil stood up and walked to the edge of the stage, motioning for his producer to join him. They spoke in hushed tones for almost 3 minutes while Margaret sat alone in the guest chair, looking small and lost under the studio lights. Then Dr. Phil walked back to Margaret and knelt beside her chair, speaking too quietly for the audience to hear. Whatever he said made Margaret's eyes widen. She nodded slowly. Dr. Phil stood up and addressed the audience directly, without cameras rolling. "Folks, we're about to do something we don't typically do on this show. With Margaret's permission, we've reached out to Rachel, and she's here in the building. She's agreed to come out and face Margaret for the first time since the funeral." The audience erupted in gasps and whispers. Margaret's hands gripped the arms of her chair so tightly her knuckles turned white. Dr. Phil looked at Margaret one more time. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Margaret's voice was barely audible, but firm. "I need to." Dr. Phil nodded to his producer. "Bring her out and let's roll cameras." The studio doors opened. A woman in her early 40s walked onto the stage, her face pale but composed. She looked at Margaret for a long moment, then took the seat Dr. Phil indicated, separated from Margaret by just a few feet and a gulf of betrayal too wide to measure. Rachel's first words were direct. "I didn't know about you. Not at first." Margaret's head snapped up. "What?" "He told me he was divorced." Rachel continued, her voice shaking slightly. "He showed me paperwork, fake documents that looked real. I didn't find out he was still married until Emma was 3 years old, and by then—" She trailed off, her eyes filling with tears. "By then, I loved him, and I had a daughter who adored her father." Dr. Phil's voice cut through the tension. "So, you made a choice to stay, knowing he was married, knowing he was lying to Margaret." "Yes," Rachel said quietly. "I made that choice, and I've regretted it every day since." The conversation that followed was raw, painful, and unlike anything that had ever aired on daytime television. Margaret demanded answers. Rachel provided details that were sometimes too honest, too brutal. How often David visited, how he explained his absences, whether he talked about Margaret, whether he seemed guilty. "He compartmentalized," Rachel said at one point. "He could be fully present with me and Emma, and then the next day be fully present with you. It was like he created 2 separate versions of himself." Margaret's anger finally broke through. "You destroyed my marriage. You took half of my husband's life. You made me unknowingly live a lie for 14 years. Rachel didn't argue. "You're right, and I'm sorry doesn't even begin to cover it. But Margaret, you need to know something. Emma exists. She's 12 years old. She's grieving her father too, and she has no idea about any of this. But what happened next is something no one in the room or watching at home saw coming." Dr. Phil, who had been listening intently, suddenly stood up. "Hold on, Rachel. You said Emma doesn't know about Margaret. But Margaret, you have 2 children. Do they know about Emma?" Margaret shook her head. "I haven't told them. I don't know how to tell them they have a half-sister they've never met." Dr. Phil walked to center stage, addressing both women and the audience. So, we have 3 children, none of whom asked for this situation, who are all victims of David's choices. We have 2 women who have